Even now, as I seek help to end my life, there is still so much beauty.
And I put up with that for about 2.5 years, and got to the point where, especially because I was seeing the pain I was in reflected in the eyes of the people that I loved. And I didn't want to have that happen.
Weight of darkness on someone. So dark and so oppressive that they can no longer see a sliver of light. Hey everyone, welcome to Bold Reflections. My name is Jasmine, and today I want to share with you guys a commercial. This commercial made its rounds a couple of months ago, but it has quietly left the mainstream awareness. And so I'm here to remind you that it is a thing that's happening. Now, in this commercial, I challenge you to notice two things: the end product and the packaging, and then we'll discuss.
Last breaths are sacred. When I imagine my final days, I see bubbles. I see the ocean. I see music. Even now, as I seek help to end my life, there is still so much beauty. You just have to be brave enough to see it.
This was indeed a real commercial for the assisted suicide industry that exists in Canada, that is completely legal, and that originally entered the narrative and the public domain, if you will, in that pretty packaging, in the packaging that convinces you at your most vulnerable state that you are the author of life and you can take the end of your life into your own hands. When you have a society that's religion is secularism, you then give up your authority completely. Your devotion is completely to either yourself or the state. And in this case, we've given the state the power to euthanize us. And of course, they don't want to be the bad guys, of course. They don't want to be painted in such a dark light. So they sell it to you as love, as light, as bubbles. Funny thing about the angel of death is that he tends to come as an angel of light. Now, originally, the narrative was, oh no, this is just for the terminally ill. This is just for people who are going to die anyway. Isn't it the righteous thing to do, to put them out of their misery? Let's contemplate that for a second with Dr. Peterson, a clinical psychologist for those who are unfamiliar. He has some thoughts about this idea, and he brings it from a perspective of having overcome what they would call a dark night of the soul. In his case, it lasted 2 years, but I want you to hear what he has to say, and we'll stop and discuss here and there.
How do you feel about MAID, expanding into mental illness and the consequences it'll bring to our society?
Okay, so I was pretty sick the last few years, and I was in a lot of pain. It took me usually for about 2.5 years, it took me about 4 hours before I could stand up. And then once I stood up, I couldn't sit down. I was walking, 9 to 12 miles a day. And then by 10 o'clock at night, I was feeling something approximating the worst I'd ever felt previously in my life, but way better than I had in the morning. And then I knew perfectly well that as soon as I went to sleep, it was going to start again. And I put up with that for about 2.5 years, and got to the point where, especially because I was seeing the pain I was in reflected in the eyes of the people that I loved. And I didn't want to have that happen anymore, And so I talked to my family about going to Switzerland. I thought, I just can't do this for the next 20 years. It didn't look like it was going to get better. And then, I tried a variety of relatively extreme treatments, and possibly one of them worked, and I started to recover. And I've been recovering now for about 16 months, probably. And it's been slow, but linear. And things are pretty good again. In fact, they're remarkably good. And tonight was a highlight for me because my son was here playing, and that went very well. And so that was very gratifying. But I'd be a liar if I said that there weren't times where if there would have been a button that would have just shut me off, I would have pushed it. Okay, so now on to medically assisted dying. We had a dog, Seagull, and near the end of his life, it was getting pretty hard for him to breathe. Every breath became an effort, and so we made the collective decision to have him put down. And we liked that dog quite a lot. He was a great relief to my daughter when she was sick, and so it was a pretty rough day when we had him put down, but it was the right thing to do. But he's a dog, He wasn't grandma. And Nietzsche said, you haven't lived long if you haven't seen that the compassionate hand sometimes kills. And, there's something to that. You got to ask yourself how much agony you would be willing to watch someone go through before you might give them a hand. But that doesn't mean that responsibility should be taken up by the government. So,
okay, before we get further into this conversation, there's so much here. Because remember, this is being packaged a certain way, but I need you guys to understand that the reality of the situation in Canada is that they will accept you for many reasons, not just terminal illness. There are stories of people who have chronic illnesses that the government doesn't want to cover anymore. Remember, they live under a healthcare system that is not privatized. You can have privatized options, but it is socialized healthcare. The same stuff that they're advocating for here to fix all of our societal woes. And I understand that our system is broken. Check out the video I did. I'll link it in the description. I'll link it in the description. But essentially, it was me reacting to a soldier crying out in pure, broken-hearted frustration, and I discussed my thoughts on all of that. And it does tie into this idea that our healthcare system can fix you. And when you realize that they can't, or that they're unwilling to, what's left? What's left for the person who has no hope? There are many stories of people coming out that they were coerced by their doctors to take this option instead. Because the truth is, keeping someone alive who's going to die anyway, or maybe they have a chronic disability, it does cost money. And so if the government's on the hook, does the state really value your life? Just some thoughts to ponder. Let's continue.
I'm opposed to capital punishment. And it's not because I don't think that there are crimes worthy of death. In fact, I know perfectly well that there are crimes so egregious that the people who commit them beg for death. That's not an uncommon outcome at sentencing trials for people like the serial sexual slayers of children who've descended far enough down into hell so that death would be a relief. And I think you have to be a fool if you think that there are not some crimes that are so brutal that virtually no punishment would be too severe. You just don't know anything about those crimes if that's what you think. But I don't think it's a good idea to give the state that power, because as untrustworthy as the criminal might be, allowing the state to make decisions about who should live and who should die, you don't know what kind of monster you're likely to conjure up doing that. So
that's a really interesting point, because I am not opposed to capital punishment. And for exactly the sentiment that he says. Also, I feel like the Bible does not condemn such a thing. In fact, there are many instances in the Bible where certain crimes, God called the people of Israel to stone things like adultery. So imagine how the Bible would approach a sex offender, for example, someone who, forced themselves on a baby, someone who did something so cruel and unjust, like murdering their own children. There are people who are committing these ugly crimes. I think that they deserve to die. But there is something to that sentiment that he's expressing as well. Is it the job of the state? The state is just a bureaucratic organization of people, and people are flawed and sinful and dark. And if they don't turn to Christ, if they don't serve Christ, there's no light there. They will always put themselves first. Their actions and mindset will be tainted by the darkness they've allowed themselves to give into. This is why we see the ugliness and the narcissism that exists in politics today. There is an authority that God gives government. So I don't know how we go about that. But anyway, I digress. That was a little bit of a rabbit hole. Let's go back to the assisted suicide stuff.
I don't know how many of you know this, and you can go look it up for yourself, but before the Nazis started their extermination program, before they started the Holocaust, they started it with a public health campaign, right? The Nazis came to power partly promising to clean up the country on the disease side, and they did. They produced universal treatments for tuberculosis. They upped the standards of hygiene in German hospitals. Then they went to the factories and started cleaning them up. And they used Zyklon B, if I remember. There's two variants of Zyklon, which is a toxic gas. And they used them in factories to get rid of the insects and the rats. And they had the factory owners clean up the factories and plant flowers and, just sort of beautify the place. And Zyklon B was a pretty effective means of eliminating parasites and insects. Then they went into mental hospitals. And, there is not much more that's more brutal than a back ward in a mental hospital before psychiatric drugs. I worked at the Douglas Hospital in Montreal after deinstitutionalization, but before some of the long-term backwards patients had passed away. And I remember taking my younger brother down into the tunnels that connected the hospital buildings on the Douglas Hospital campus, which was kind of like a university. And it was like Dante's Inferno down there, man. You can't imagine how damaged those people were. 30 years on a back ward in a locked psychiatric clinic. Jesus, imagine being manic or schizophrenic under those conditions, locked in a straitjacket maybe for 20 years, maybe in agony. You just can't imagine what that would be like for decades. And the Nazis basically said that. They said, Jesus, if you guys went into those back wards, you'd think death is preferable. And plus, it's not like it's cheap to keep those people alive in their desperate suffering. And we could spend that money on the typical thing that, implicitly psychopathic murderers pretend to spend money on, like education. And so, away the Germans went and cleaned up the asylums. And then the disabled were sort of next on the list because it turned out they were kind of expensive too and inconvenient. And you're going to be expensive and inconvenient at some point. You're probably that already. And you'll probably be expensive, inconvenient, and desperate at some point too. Highly probable. Most people have, many people have at least one episode of severe depression in their life. And severe depression will make you suicidal. That's one of its cardinal symptoms. And one of the accompanying thoughts that characterizes severe depression is everyone would be better off without me. And
how many people are suffering with that exact mentality right now? We live in an unprecedented time of anxiety and depression, especially when it comes to a society that we've created that villainizes men, that is currently actively coming after the nuclear family. Broken marriages, a traumatic childhood. It's a desperately sad situation. And they often think to themselves when they are in this dark spiral, exactly that. The world is better off without me. But that is a lie. You don't know the impact that you could have, that your story could have on someone. You have no idea. But I digress. Let's continue.
You can think about that as self-pitying, and sometimes it is. That's usually accompanied by kind of delusional notions about how sad and hurt everyone will be at the funeral and how sorry they'll be for picking on you. And that's not depression. That's narcissistic neuroticism. Depression is accompanied by the genuine belief that you're pretty damn useless and everyone around you would be better off without you. And I'm sure many of you have thought that at some point in your life already. And are you so sure that you wouldn't have called up the friendly Trudeau government and had them give you a hand just at that point? I think it's 30,000 people we've already managed to dispense with in this country. Wow. As I said already, you know, Canada's international reputation is in tatters and we're just getting going. So
30,000 people. 30,000 people already. When did this program start? I need to look that up. If anyone knows, tell me in the comments. But like, that is dark. That is really dark. The fact that the government, the Trudeau Canadian government, has created a culture and an option and a resentment from the medical personnel and the bureaucracy against life. Let's not even talk about how many babies are being murdered in the womb, but just in this culture of death that permeates the entire West, but we're talking about just Canada right now, right? 30,000 people have chosen this option. How many people could have overcome this and gone on to do great things or influence even just one person? Even if they touched one person, let's say they chose the gospel and they got through and it touched them so deeply from this dark night of the soul that they shared it with one other person. And that other person, you planted a seed and maybe it gets watered and maybe it doesn't. But you don't know if you just remove yourself from the game. I don't think the government has the right to do that.
Now you might ask yourself, well, how did we handle this before medically assisted death? And the answer is, physicians and family members bore the burden on their own conscience. You know, and it wasn't uncommon, but it wasn't publicly discussed, let's say, that, you know, at some point you decide to take grandpa off his heart medication. Or maybe, you know, great-grandma's got Alzheimer's and she's in excruciating pain and the physician provides a little more opiate than is strictly necessary. And, you know, everybody just takes that burden on themselves very, very carefully and cautiously. And it's the family, to the degree that anybody has the right to make that decision, it's the family that has the right and the responsibility. You know, now I'm not arguing for the propriety of, you know, your personal physician-aided opiate overdose. The devil's in the details all the time, but
the devil's in the details. Ooh, I've heard that little phrase like a million times, and that just really hit me a certain way just now. Anyway.
I don't trust the people who can't get you a passport in 2 weeks to decide whether or not grandma gets to live.
Wow, there's so much there. I think of suicide as this weight of darkness on someone. So dark and so oppressive that they can no longer see a sliver of light. And I truly believe that Jesus is that light. And that if you so truly believe in him, if you find yourself in this moment of complete and utter darkness, where the voices in your soul are telling you to end it here, that the world would be better off without you, I believe that even if you had just a tiny little bit of hope, just a tiny little sliver, such a small little ray of hope to make it through that moment, that is the hand of God. And that you're meant to be here and proclaim the gospel and save someone else. Then don't choose this option. Like I said in the beginning, the devil comes as an angel of light. But in that moment, it's not the devil's light. It's Jesus. Kind of a sad topic today. But if you enjoy this video, if you think that what we are discussing here is valuable, especially considering the culture that we currently live in, I have 2 requests. First, please like this video. The more you like it, the more it can be shown to others. And 2, if you don't mind checking out the So This Is the World podcast, I co-host it with my friend Michelle from It's a Girl Thing, and we discuss topics like this. It's a pretty cool show, so go check that out. Thanks for watching. And as always, God bless.